Hello, students. We are moving into our chapter 6, which is the American Revolution. And we are going to begin here with our lesson 1, the War for Independence. And I will begin by reading in the textbook under the two armies face off. We are looking for, early on, why did both sides believe the Revolutionary War was going to be short? In April 1776, colonial leader John Adams predicted we shall have a long and bloody war to go through. Few people agreed with him. Each side thought that they would win the war quickly. The British planned to crush the colonists by force. Most patriots, Americans who supported independence, believed the British would give up after losing one or two major battles. And so we have our answer there. The British, they felt that the war was going to be short because they planned to simply crush the rebellion by force. And of course, the rebellion is the Americans. And remember, we referred to the Americans as the underdog, right? Because they have a lot less going for them on their side of the war. And so they thought it was going to be a quick and easy defeat of the Americans. And then the Americans, on the other hand, believed that the British would give up after losing one or two battles. And neither one of these things is true. The Revolutionary War is going to last for several years. As you remember, our first battle of the Revolutionary War was Battle of Lexington and Concord, and that was in 1775, on April 19th, 1775, and it's going to continue until 1783. And so this is going to cover several years, not just a couple battles that are won by the Americans or by the British. So in that same paragraph, actually, it answered number 2 as well. Who predicted that it was going to be a long and bloody war? And that part actually came first, that said, we shall have a long and bloody war to go through. And that was predicted by John Adams. And we've talked a little bit about John Adams. We've seen John Adams before in chapter 5 with the Road to Revolution information. I'm going to pause there for a moment to let you make sure that you have that information. As we are moving forward, as we get ready to move forward, we're going to talk about British advantages and disadvantages and American advantages and disadvantages. And so it kind of comes in a couple different places in the text. So I will first read the British advantages that you see here, and we'll answer those questions first, and then we'll kind of flip-flop through the pages to get the information that we need, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and change here. British advantages and Patriot advantages. So we're going to read under British advantages first. As the war began, the British seemed to have a big advantage. They had the strongest navy in the world. The British also had a well-trained army. They were supported by the wealth of their empire. Great Britain also had more people. More than 8 million people lived in Britain. There were only 2.5 million Americans. The Patriots did not seem to be a match for the British. They had no regular army and a weak navy. American soldiers also lacked experience and weapons for fighting. Much of the Patriot military force was in the form of militia groups. These volunteer soldiers fought only for short periods of time and then returned home. In addition, not all Americans supported the struggle for independence. Some Americans remained loyal to Britain. Others, such as the Quakers, were neutral. They would not take part in war because they opposed all armed conflict. And we talked about Quakers back in chapter 3, that they were pacifists. They did not believe in violence of any kind. Okay, so we are going to begin with the British advantages, which you see here on the left-hand column. And so the British advantages, again, these are pretty great advantages, and we're going to find all of them in this first paragraph here. So they had the strongest navy in the world. And remember that navy is the branch of the military that has ships. Now, they also have a well-trained army. The British also have the wealth of an empire, so they have the money to support their soldiers in the war. And they have a larger population, 8 million people that lived in Britain. Now, of course, not all 8 million of them are going to be involved in the fight, but the more people you have, the more chances there are that those people are going to fight in the war and they are going to join the army. So here's where we're going to do a little flip-flopping, because here where they talk about the British advantages, they also talk about the Americans or the Patriots' disadvantages. So we'll come back to this page in a minute. So if you don't have all 4 of these things, you can come back and get it, because we're also going to come back to look for the disadvantages. So we're going to just move forward here. And we're going to look for the disadvantages of the Americans. And that is going to come from these second 2 paragraphs, or the second and third paragraph, that they did not seem to be a match for Britain. And so one of their first disadvantages is that they did not have a regular army. Not at first anyways. We did talk about that they created the Continental Army and that George Washington will become the commander of it. But when this war began, they did not have a regular army. Which is also going to give them another disadvantage here. They, first of all, in the text it says they have a weak navy, but they in fact do not have a navy, so they have no navy. The third one goes along with number 1, that they do not have trained soldiers. So when they start to form an army, their soldiers are not trained. We talked about before that most of the people during this time are able to use a gun. They know how to shoot. They know how to hit their target, but they're not trained as soldiers. So they're untrained soldiers. They have a short supply of weapons and ammunition. So we saw that prime example at the Battle of Bunker Hill when the Americans were told don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, because they were trying to conserve their ammunition that they had. But this was a problem throughout the war, that they were in short supply of weapons and ammunition. So the 5th one is the fact that they had militia soldiers and that they didn't stay for a specific amount of time. Militia soldiers, remember, are volunteers. They fight in the emergency situations. Nothing says that they had to continue to fight. So they could come and fight for a month and then decide that they were going to leave and go back home. They might come back again, but they didn't have to. And so this kind of made the militia unreliable. And that is going to be difficult for them to make a battle plan if they don't have soldiers that they can rely on. And then our last disadvantage for the Americans here is that not all Americans supported independence. And again, we know this because we've talked about the Patriots versus the Loyalists, right? And the Loyalists are colonists. They're Americans that continue to support Great Britain. They have their loyalty to Great Britain. And so this is obviously causing that friction within the colonies itself, making it also a civil war between people of the same country. I'm going to go ahead and leave that there for a second, and I am going to change the pages. We're going to come back to the Loyalists and the colonists, but we still have to get the disadvantages and advantages for the rest of this part. So that is going to be here, yep, under advantages of the Patriots. And so we're going to stay right here and we're going to complete this column, and then we'll go back and do the British, okay? So The Patriots did hold some advantages. They were fighting on their own ground. The British, on the other hand, had to fight from thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. It took time and money to ship soldiers and supplies. The Patriot soldiers also had greater motivation or sense of purpose. The British relied on mercenaries to fight them. The Americans called these mercenaries Hessians after the region in Germany from which most of them came. The Patriots fought for freedom of their own land. This gave them a greater stake in the war's outcome than soldiers who fought for money. The Americans also lured the Hessians away with promises of land. The Patriots' greatest advantage was probably their leader, George Washington. Few could match him for courage and determination. The war might have taken a different turn without Washington. So, our advantages, they're sort of sprinkled throughout these paragraphs here, but our first one is that they were fighting on their own land. And that's an advantage because that means that they know the land, the good ways that they can approach their attack, but also ways that they can use the land to help defend themselves as well. And we saw a little bit of that at Lexington and Concord, where the militia soldiers used the things around them to help protect them. They hid behind rocks and trees and fences and homes so that they were able to use that surprise attack on the British. They also used kind of a shortcut to get back before the British did so that they could attack them. So that's definitely an advantage, knowing that land and how to use it. Second, here's in the second paragraph, they have a greater motivation or sense of purpose. They are defending not only this fight for independence, but they're defending their homes, their family, and their freedom. And so if they lose this war, they lose a whole lot more than the British are going to lose. Okay? These are the people who live here. They're fighting for their livelihood. So it talks about the mercenaries there, and we talked about mercenaries before, that there are hired killers, right? So they're being paid by the king to fight in this war. They don't actually care who wins or loses, especially these Hessians, which are from Germany. They're not even British soldiers. And so it talked about in the 1.2 that some of the Americans were able to persuade the Hessians to come and fight for their side by offering them land or other riches. And so it's who can pay me the better price, I'll fight for your side. So they don't have any loyalty. And that is what we're going to see could be a disadvantage or is a disadvantage for the British. So we're going to be talking about that again in a minute. And then the perhaps greatest advantage was their leader, George Washington. They had a great leader. Now we have one more here that the text doesn't give us, and that is also something that we have mentioned before, we've talked about before, that these Americans own their own weapons. And so that meant that they were experienced shooters. So that was definitely a step in the right direction. They were able to, like I said before, hit their targets. They knew what they were doing at least. So that was definitely a plus when it came to having to be trained as soldiers. I'm going to go ahead and give you a moment to finish writing those, and then we'll go back to the disadvantages of the British. Okay, so before I turn the page, we're going to find the first one here, that the British, you're going to see that when it's a disadvantage for the Americans, it tends to be an advantage for the British and vice versa. They sort of go against each other, right? And so I'm going to uncover these again because we already did these, but in case you still need to write them. The British are fighting from thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. So it takes them time to get their supplies and their soldiers from overseas. So shipping their supplies thousands of miles over the Atlantic Ocean costs lots of time and money. And remember, we've talked about this a lot, that journey from Europe to the Americas is about 3 months. If everything goes the way that you want it to, closer probably to 4 months, could even be longer than that. That's a long time to wait for your reinforcements and for your supplies. They're not going to be getting a lot of that from the colonies themselves, even though there are loyalists there who are going to help supply them with things. There's not enough. They're going to need more. The second one has to do with the mercenaries. That comes right here, that the soldiers who fought for money had less at stake. They were hired mercenaries. They were paid to kill. They were easily lured away with more the promise of land because they didn't care who won. When the war was over, they were going back home. They were going back to Germany and they were going to live their lives. They didn't care. And frankly, that could be the way that British soldiers saw it as well, because these soldiers, when the war is done, most likely are going to go back to Britain as well. Now, some of them are going to remain stationed in the colonies. We've seen that already from other wars, but a lot of them are going to return home. So in the long run, it probably doesn't matter too much to them either who wins this war. It really matters to the Americans, to the people who live in the colonies. And then the last one here is one that's not in the textbook, but it's one that's kind of an important one. So we've talked about before, you've seen some images of British soldiers. They wear red coats, right? So this is a disadvantage. And it's a disadvantage because they stick out like targets as they're walking through the countryside. There's like no good way to camouflage a red coat when you're fighting in a war. Think about what present day soldiers wear. They wear camouflage, right? And they even wear different colors of camouflage depending on where they're fighting. If they're fighting in like a jungle area that has grassy areas and green trees, they wear that more of a green color camouflage. But if they're fighting in a desert, they wear more of like that sandy color camouflage. So they want to blend in with their surroundings. Red isn't blending in with any surroundings any time of the year. In the springtime, they're going to really stick out. In the fall time, they're going to continue to stick out. There's not a lot of red even in the fall, maybe some orangey colors, browns, right? But red's still going to stick out. And red in the winter, they're just walking targets. That's something that's going to be a great disadvantage for them. So we are going to go on to the next heading is loyalists in the colonies, and I need to go backwards for this. So once again, I will leave that there for a moment. And our first thing that we're looking for is a nickname for loyalists. So at least 1 in 5 Americans were thought to be a loyalist or a Tory. The number may have been as high as 1 in 3. These Americans remain loyal to Britain and opposed independence. Some Americans changed sides during the war. Loyalist support also varied from region to region. In general, support for Britain was strongest in the Carolinas and Georgia, and weakest in New England. Loyalists had reasons to support. Actually, do I want to go on with that one? Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, we're going to hold off so we'll answer that first question on nickname for loyalists. So it tells you right here at the beginning that a loyalist is also called a Tory. The plural of it is Tories, Tories. And that name actually was coming from a political party that was in Great Britain. So they called them loyalists or they called them Tories. So as you write that, I'm going to continue on because our next one is, what are some of the reasons the Loyalists supported Britain? So Loyalists had reasons to support Britain. Some depended on the British for jobs. Some feared the revolution would throw America into chaos. Others simply could not understand why the colonies wanted independence. For them, patriot complaints seemed minor and not worth fighting over. And that, I'm going to stop there again so we can answer these next questions. And so all of those come right here in this paragraph. So our first one is the reason why they supported Britain is because some depended on the British for their jobs. The second one is some feared the revolution would throw America into chaos. And then the last one is that some people just didn't understand why the colonies wanted independence. They didn't really see what there was to gain. They thought the things that they were complaining over were kind of like minor things. And we've sort of talked about this before too, that nobody loves taxes, right? But they complained about those taxes. And it wasn't the taxes themselves that gave them a problem. It was the bigger picture. It was that they were being told what to do, but not given a voice in government. But some people still weren't understanding why that was actually a problem. So our next one here is one where we have the answer and you need to type in the question. So our answer says promised freedom for participation in the war. So we're going to read the next paragraph to see if we can come up with a question. And I'm going to click off of that. The British actively sought the support of African Americans. Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to the African Americans who joined the British cause. Many men answered his call. Eventually, some of them ended up free in Canada. Others settled in the British colony of Sierra Leone in Africa. So promised freedom for participation in the war. So we see here promised freedom to African Americans who joined the British cause. So we need to have a question that combines these two things together. So who are we talking about in that sentence? Because we didn't say who we're talking about in the answer over there. So that means that has to be part of our question. And I have it highlighted over here in the blue. Who are we talking about? African Americans, slaves specifically. And so they are going to be possibly fighting for which side? According to that blue highlighted part, it would be the British. So we need to combine those two things together to create a question that would give us this answer, promised freedom for participation in the war. And so it was the British are asking slaves to join their army by promising them what? So we want to say, how did the British try to get slaves to join their army? They promised freedom for participation in the war. That makes sense, right? So once again, your question can be a little bit different. If you would have come up with something that was similar, but not the exact word for word question, that would be okay. We definitely have to have that we're talking about the British and slaves or African Americans. It could say African Americans there. That would be fine too. Or it could say blacks. That would be okay too. So the British are getting slaves or African Americans to join their army by doing what? And the answer is promise freedom for participation in the war. So number 4, how did the war affect friends and families in the colonies? I'm going to continue to read. Loyalty to Britain divided friends and family. For example, William Franklin, son of patriot Benjamin Franklin, was a loyalist who had served as a royal governor of New Jersey. The disagreement caused lasting damage to their relationship. As one Connecticut man observed, neighbor was against neighbor, father against son, and son against father. And he that would not thrust his own blade through his brother's heart was called an infamous villain. So we talked a little bit about this before, that again, it was a civil war, friend to friend, neighbor to neighbor, family members are split over who they are supporting in the war. And I've mentioned even Benjamin Franklin and his son were on opposite sides of the war. So how did the war affect friends and families in the colonies? Well, it put them against each other, right? They were divided over their loyalty between Great Britain, and they had to fight against each other. And of course, nobody wants to fight their family members. Nobody wants to fight their friends. Nobody wants to fight their neighbors. It's not something that you would like to see happen. So now you might be wondering, it makes sense kind of that neighbors might have different opinions, even friends might have different opinions, but it might seem odd as to why family members might have different opinions, or maybe it doesn't. I mean, you can consider what political opinions you have in your own families. Do you have parents and aunts and uncles that have different views on how our country should be run or things that should be done in our country? Maybe you do. I know we do in my family. We have different views on who should be running the country, whether it should be Democrat or whether it should be Republican, what things should be paid for, what things shouldn't be paid for, how much money should go in for, say, education or defense, things like that. And so sometimes it's going to even cause that great division. Now, luckily, we don't have to pick a side of a war to fight on, right? And so in my family, we just kind of don't talk about it. It's not worth talking about it because then we're going to be upset with each other. I'm not going to sway someone in my family to my point of view. They're not going to sway me to their point of view. So it kind of doesn't make any sense to try. But it could come to the point where it would be in the situation where there was a war, and then you would have to pick sides and you would have to decide, is what I feel more important than my family, or is my family more important than what I feel is right for the country? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But typically there was a method here. And so some families are split. Usually it was the older generation that were the loyalists because they immigrated from England. And so they knew England as their home. They were born there. They grew up there. Maybe they started their family there. They knew that to be their home and their country, and the king was their king. Whereas the younger generation, now many of them were born in America, never set foot in England, have no tie to Great Britain at all. They don't think the king is their king. They don't think Great Britain is their country. They may not even have any desire to return to Great Britain. Maybe even all of their family is in America now as well. Or they were born in England and came at a very young age. So again, also don't have any of those ties to Great Britain specifically. And so in that case, then they feel like these things outweigh, heritage, where we came from originally. Now, the weird part here is the switch in Benjamin Franklin and his son, because it was Benjamin Franklin who was the patriot and it was his son who was the loyalist. So when I say that this is usually the explanation, I have right away an example of where it didn't happen in that way. Benjamin Franklin was born in England. He moved to America, so he wasn't always here. He knew England as his home and his king, and his son was in America longer. But for some reason, they were opposite. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with, especially for Benjamin Franklin, was the fact that he was such a progressive thinker in all of his inventions and all of his discoveries that he had, and just such a wise man in general. And so I think that is why he knew that being a patriot was the right thing to do. So this is where we're going to And for part 1 of lesson 1, you'll notice that we're not done with lesson 1, but we're going to pause there for today.